Live on Facebook. So welcome everyone tonight to the Nevada PTA Town Hall regarding the education budget. My name is Rebecca Garcia and I am the president of the Nevada Parent Teachers Association. And this town hall is part of a series that we're doing right now called Moving Forward. And we're looking at issues that impact families and students and education here in Nevada. And so one of those key things is how education is funded. And we have a great panel with us tonight that I'm really excited to hear from. First, we have moderating with us Dr. Kenneth Retzl from the Guinn Center. He's the Director of Education Policy and previously also served with CCSD as the Director with Accountability and Data Services. And so thank you, Kenny, for joining us tonight as our moderator.
Yes, thank you for having me. Excited for the conversation.
Yeah. And we also have Michaela Tonkin, who is a school finance expert. She has master's degrees in both business administration with a focus in accounting, as well as urban education policy, and has spent many of the last years focused on school funding formulas and school finance, not just here in Nevada, but across the country with many different states. So Michaela, we're excited to hear from you as well.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
And finally, last but not least, Senator Ben Kieckhefer, who is a veteran Nevada legislator from Northern Nevada in the Washoe-Carson City area. He is also the father of 4, 2 sets of twins, which I think you'd win some sort of prize for that, or your wife does. But we found out that we have a child, we have Lucy's in common, so that makes everything right? Parents always find those little links to bring us together. So thank you, Senator Kieckhefer, for joining us.
I appreciate the invitation. Thanks for having me.
So I know that the idea of school funding may not sound particularly exciting for a lot of people, but when it comes to education, it's a topic that you can't separate from the success of an education system, because funding impacts what services can be provided so directly. And right now, obviously, is a time of great flux in Nevada and in the country. And so this topic is even more relevant. And so I will turn it over to Kenny to get us started on the discussion tonight. I should say one thing. If people have questions, you're welcome to put them in the Facebook feed. I will be monitoring that. And then we will save time at the end to answer any questions that we may not have already covered during the course of the discussion.
Great. Michaela, Senator Kieckhefer, again, thanks for joining us today. Looking forward to this conversation. When I saw the topic of education funding and education finance and budgets, I mean, it's a huge topic, right? We could spend a couple hours each on looking at how funding comes into the state of Nevada in terms of the taxes, right? The tax structure that funds education. We could also talk about how the legislature approves a budget that then distributes money down to the individual districts. We could also spend a couple of hours talking about how districts then allocate that money to the schools. And then finally, we could talk about how those schools decide to ultimately allocate that money back down to the student level, right? And to get to it. And so I guess I'd like to start off by asking you guys both sort of a really, really high level question that I don't think gets enough or asked enough when we start talking about education funding in general. I see education funding as a how. It's a very important how, right? But it's not, in my mind, it's not the ultimate goal of education to just increase money to education, right? We're trying to do something with that money. And so my question for you both to sort of ground this conversation is, what is that North Star that Nevada should be aiming for in terms of education? And then bonus points, because the Guinn Center loves data, bonus points if you can give me how you would measure that, or how you would know that we got there or we met the goal.
I can hop in first. So I think this is like a common question that we all try to think about and decide, like what or how do we know that we've reached our final goal, and how do we know how much that is? And I think for me, it's making sure that we have provided both equity, so meaning that we are having equity across our districts, but also equity across our students, meaning that kids who have additional needs are being provided the services they need for those needs. And I think it's also making sure that we have the correct resources in schools. So it's not saying that, hey, we have this much money, but we spent it all on teacher salaries. It's saying, hey, we have this much money, but we bought some of these social emotional learnings, or just really making sure that it meets the specific needs of each of those districts and having those resources. When I sit in on professional judgment panels and we have experts come in and tell us this is what we need, I know that it varies so greatly. Sometimes schools need nurses and they don't have any nurses and they have a high IEP population, or some schools need social workers and they don't have any, or family liaisons. So I think it's being really aware that each district has different needs. And I think how we can measure that is seeing both success performance-wise, and then you'll also see success in other measurement forms. So I know in like Wyoming, they measure career and technical skills, and they see great success in that because they provide a lot of those skills. So I think it's just being aware, making sure that we are providing the correct resources to our students.
All right. And Michaela talked about a lot of really sort of the important things, but to me, the North Star just sort of continues to be the kids, right? And whether they are ready to be competitive when they exit their K-12 environment, regardless of their next step. So if they are competitive going into a university, a community college, a union training program, whatever the workforce situation may be for them, if they are ready to compete, excel, and grow in that environment, then the K-12 system will have done their job. In my mind, money is an input, and I'm much more interested in the output, which is the success of the students on their way out the door, across the stage, wherever it may be. From a measurement perspective, I think measuring that competitiveness, especially at the higher education level, is something we can do, something that we do actually on a regular annual basis within the Nevada system of higher education, at least, and we know we have room to make up there. And I'd be interested in seeing us track more of sort of what Michaela was talking about in terms of skill development that's necessary for our new economy, and how many students are being prepared for jobs that don't yet exist, right? And that's something that we don't track at all, from what I can tell, but something that we're going to need to pretty quickly as our economy turns over.
Yeah, exactly. And Senator Kieckhefer, that last part of what the new Nevada economy looks like is especially salient right now, given the economic straits that we're in right now. So, but we will touch on that shortly as well. So now moving into the more substantive budget questions. This last legislative session, sort of the hallmark piece of legislation that came out, at least for education advocates, was the new funding formula, right? The pupil-centered funding plan. Before digging too deep into that, Michaela, I was wondering if you might be able to give us if it's possible, a high-level overview of the Nevada plan and sort of compare and contrast it to what the Nevada plan was, and then what the pupil-centered funding plan is going to be.
Yeah. So the Nevada plan was one of only 2 funding formulas that existed in the country that was based off of historical expenditures. So whatever was spent in the past, you would spend that plus some inflation dollars. And then that would give you your base amount of money. The difference with the new plan now is the new plan is based more on a successful schools model, or possibly eventually an adequacy model. But the idea is that the base has some meaning to it, as opposed to an arbitrary number based on the past. And then from there, the old Nevada plan had what you call categorical funding. And categorical funding is just a bunch of buckets where you can add a grant to and be like, for example, if you're an English language learner, we called it Zoom funding. Here's so much money, and this goes to these certain schools, and they can provide services. And we'll do that for a bunch of different categories, class size reduction, and all just a bunch of categorical grants. And so what the Nevada plan does, or the new Nevada plan, it now has what we call weights. And so the idea of a weight is you get an additional amount for each student you have that falls into a specific category. Or if your district is small, you might get additional funding based on a weight. And so all of those numbers are driven by whatever the base amount is. So if your base amount is really low, then the amount of additional funding that students will get is low, and then if it's higher, etc. So basically what the new Nevada plan did from the old Nevada plan is gave us some understanding of what the costs were and what was driving these new revenue sources and bringing them places. The problem is it's still the same money, it's just dividing it in a different way. And so that's really the main thing to think about, is you still are taking the same money, you're just slicing it a little differently, but at least the way you're slicing it is makes more intrinsic sense.
Well, and Senator Kieckhefer, maybe you could address us a little bit too, that Michaela was talking about how it's a historical funding model, or it's based off of historical expenditures. And a lot of people have been upset, for lack of a better word, frustrated, I guess, about the Nevada plan and this idea that a lot of money is being supplanted, right? That there's sort of this idea that marijuana money and room tax dollars were going to go to education. And they are going to education, but they're also not going to education. Could you speak a little bit about that and sort of how it's not a nefarious thing, but how that supplanting works within sort of the construct of the Nevada plan?
Yeah, absolutely. It's based on the way the distributed school account is built and that the Nevada plan is built. If you put more money in the top from a new funding source, for example, marijuana money, IP1 room tax money, one of those sources, it basically requires less general fund appropriation at the bottom of the pyramid in order to maintain what we consider the base funding amount, the basic support that is necessary to fund education at X level. So as Michaela said, we take actual expenditures from all of the districts down at a very sort of finite level, add some multipliers onto them, figure out where we want to be. We roll up everything by 2% and then, some inflation adjustments and all this and that. And we come up with ultimately the amount that we want to have for total operations. We start backing out different revenue streams. And so when you slip a new revenue stream in there, that bottom line that's unfunded that we're going to use general fund to make up for shrinks. And so that's what's happened over time with IP1 room tax money, which a lot of people, I think, rightfully expected to be additive to the system. And it will be, it requires then less general fund in the end. I think hopefully that answers the question.
For sure. And so I guess the follow-on question for either of you guys would be, how is the new plan, this people-centered funding model, how is that addressing that sort of supplanting issue itself? Is it addressing it, or are we stuck with that same sort of general fund contribution last?
Well, Michaela may want to weigh in, but ultimately it's pooling all of our resources into one bucket, right? So whereas usually we pull off, we get the total dollar figure we're trying to reach, and then we start backing out local school support tax, and then we back out property tax, and we back out all of these other education dedicated resource streams, and then we add in the general fund. So this puts it all into one big bucket to start with, and has a sort of policy statement to maintain that sort of general fund contribution at a level on a go forward basis. And Michaela could probably explain that better than I can.
No, I think that was great. It pools all the money together. What goes into that pool will be what's interesting as your starting off point, to make sure that where we're starting off is IP1 going into the pool later every time. Is it going to go in right away and just be additive? That will be what will be interesting to see. But what it does say is, it says that we can see it must increase by, if the economy is increasing, we should see that those dollars increase if applicable or if possible. So that means that as long as there's nothing wrong with the economy, so given right now, probably not going to happen. But usually if there's nothing going on, then we will see those dollars increase. Again, it will probably be similar to what we see, just the inflation amounts at some extent, depending on what inflation dollars they use. And I think it's important to note that inflation doesn't always cover the costs that a lot of these districts face. And that's a big issue across the country, is we see states funding using inflation, but sometimes it doesn't cover the actual costs that a lot of these districts are continuing to bear, especially around transportation is a big one.
If I could, Kenny, I'd like to sort of jump back in off what Michaela said regarding categorical funding. And so what I think a lot of what we just described is how to get to sort of base per pupil amount, right? Which is the number that people throw out there, $6,200 a student or whatever it is all the time. That's not what we can spend comprehensively on education. We know that. But there's a reason those categories were built over time, right? And I think that the legislature has historically had somewhat of a lack of faith in the districts to implement policies thoroughly with the money that was appropriated. So, for example, in 2015, as we were, created the commerce tax to increase more money for education, we didn't want to just dump it into the DSA and increase that per pupil amount because we didn't have a lot of faith that it was going to go to the things that we thought were most necessary. So we, fund Zoom schools, we fund Victory schools, things like Read by 3 to try to know what we're purchasing when we put more revenue into education. And I think it's going to be important to monitor how those types of expectations from a education delivery standpoint flow with the new funding formula.
I was just going to jump in and kind of ask for clarification. If I'm not used to looking at these numbers in the budget all the time, with the transition from the old Nevada plan to the new one, like I have a kid who's entering the 8th grade. Is he going to see significant increases in education funding before he graduates high school? Like, is that something that's automatically built into the plan, or is it essentially going to move forward similar amounts of funding that we've seen historically, just in different ways?
Yeah. So it would be the same amount of funding that we have seen. That's what's going into the pot. It's just dividing it differently. And the idea being that with like the weights versus categoricals is where you'd see the biggest difference in that, saying that every student will get those dollars instead, or get a percentage of those dollars instead of just certain schools getting those categorical dollars. And that also helps create equity across the system. But with no new dollars, it's really hard to use the minimal amount of dollars that state schools could receive in those weights. So that could be an issue. But the idea is that the money is the same. There's no change in revenue source that is increasing that pot in any way.
And that, I guess, leads me to my next question. I mean, you guys are both talking about categoricals, and I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into categoricals because there's a really interesting, is probably the wrong word, but there's this conversation that's going around about what to do with the categorical funding. Right. So, Senator, you said that it was a huge investment in Nevada's education in 2015 with these categorical dollars. But unfortunately, I believe it was sold sort of as the first step towards a weighted funding formula, right? It was a way to differentiate funding based on student needs. And so now, because there isn't additional dollars flowing in to education, there's this conversation of what do you do with those categorical funds or categorical programs now under a weighted funding formula, and that people are wondering, could we still grandfather in some of those schools that are receiving the categorical funding for either ELL or English language learner students or students considered at risk at Victory schools, for to say, but do you grandfather in those categorical schools, or do you say, well, I'm sorry, there's no additional money, so now that money that we had for categoricals is going to now be spread out even more so going forward?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, right? Because, and to illustrate the point, right, what we've done primarily with the two largest programs, right, Zoom and Victory, those are school-based programs. We did make some additional appropriations to send out money for a student-based population, but primarily they're school-based. So if we believe that this weighted funding formula in the pupil-centered plan is weighted appropriately and it has the correct resources in it, then we should believe in its ability to function and distribute funding where it needs to go. I think it's difficult to do that when you're not fully funding those programs, right? When you're not fully funding the weights and getting them to where they need to be, ripping a program out of a school that has had proven success, I think would be inappropriate. So if we can get to the point where we fund these programs based on what we expect them to accomplish, then yes, I think you eliminate things like Zoom and Victory. But until then, I think it's a really hard expectation to rip those programs out of schools where students are having success.
Yeah, I also agree with Senator Kieckhefer. I mean, if there's no additional dollars, you're just taking those Zoom and Victory dollars and spreading them across all of the students in the state. And it's a big issue that districts and states talk about all the time, is that maybe they're given some additional dollars, but it's not enough to buy a staff, or it's not enough to buy certain resources. And so I think we'd run into that issue more across the entire state, where it needs to be more phased in. But we do have to remember that those weights need to start to get phased in quickly, or else there's a big equity issue, right? Just because my school happens to be a Zoom school and I'm an EL student, I get all these benefits. But if I'm another EL student who's 2 streets down and I go to a different school, but my school isn't a Zoom school, I don't get those services. And so it has to be made very clear to the state that that's a big equity issue that could become a problem over
time. I think you guys are touching on the thing, and I don't know that it's an important topic to talk about. The hold harmless, they're all important topics in this right now, right? Especially considering everything, but there's this hold harmless in the rural areas. And I guess it's not as much of a question as it is just sort of a general observation or comment that you guys are talking about. Sort of the reallocation of resources are going to have impacts, especially with no additional dollars, right? And so we're seeing it in the categoricals program, so in weighted funding in the new one, but we're also going to see it in the rural school districts as well. That there is a hold harmless provision, but you're starting to see that without additional dollars, you're just rearranging funding, not necessarily increasing it to anyone. So I guess it does lead to my question of, there have been a few murmurs out in the community, at least, of, given the current economic environment where we're not necessarily sure if there's going to be significant cuts in the future, is there a possibility that this pupil-centered funding plan, we hit pause on it for a little bit? Going into, so it's supposed to take effect next, not this coming school year, but the school year after, correct? So is that a possibility? And Senator, maybe that's a question for you. Is that a possibility of hitting the pause button to see what all these economic ramifications are?
Well, I think we're doing a whole lot of regrouping now, and we can talk about what some of that might look like just for the upcoming school year here in a little bit. But ultimately, it's going to be up to the governor, and really it's in his authority alone to decide how to structure the education budget for fiscal years 22 and 23. He can, I think by the statute, he's required to sort of respect the new formula, but based on implementation, you can really, do it a number of different ways, I think, and I think that's going to have to be a policy decision that gets made when we have a better understanding of what the resources are and what the willingness might be to get new ones.
Sorry, I was on mute there for a second. Still trying to get used to this Zoom world that we're living in. Maybe I'll just jump ahead to the question now that we're sort of talking about it, that there has been a special session called. We're not exactly sure when it's going to be, but we know it's coming soon. I guess, what does a successful special session look like for education advocates, or what can education advocates hope to see out of that when we're starting to look at that there could be some significant cuts coming down the road?
Success in an environment like this is sort of hard to define, and it's difficult. We're not in a position that anyone wants to be in, no one anticipated being in, and it's the reality we face. So for perspective, in the next fiscal year, which starts July 1st, which encompasses the next school year, we expect revenue shortfalls of about $1.3 billion. That's inclusive of the distributed school account and the education-based funding that goes in there, particularly the local school support tax, which is the sales tax, and then the room tax dollars. So, and when K-12 education takes up a third of your budget, your general fund budget, it's impossible to make the budget balance in the way we're constitutionally bound by without addressing some reductions to education funding. So I think trying to minimize that impact is certainly my goal. Minimize the impact on students and in the classroom. But we're trying to envision this at the same time that we don't really understand what school is going to look like in the fall either, which makes it all the more complicated. I know the Clark County School District is preparing to present its reopening plan on Thursday. I think Washoe was a little behind, and I'm not sure exactly where some of the other 15 districts are. But I think a successful outcome at this point is trying to minimize impact on the classroom and on students, but recognizing that that's not entirely possible.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I think, it's a good time to also start looking across the country and seeing where all their other cuts are coming as well. We're going to see a lot of states who are going to bounce back out of this much faster because they have much more stable revenue sources. A lot of our revenue is relying on sales tax and room taxes, which are less likely to be used or to be coming by right now. So I think that's really important, but I think it's a good time to start to see how other states are handling this and how they're making some of those cuts. The biggest issue is I know that a lot of states, and Nevada included, haven't really come back from the last recession in terms of school funding. And so it'll be really interesting to see. They haven't even probably hired the same amount of staff that they had before the last recession now. So it'll be interesting to see what additional cuts are truly available that won't harm our students. And so I think that will be definitely an area where we need to start to look into.
And it's just important to note a lot of what we decide at the legislature in terms of reductions to spending are not necessarily in our control in terms of how they get implemented on the ground, right? So if we reduce basic support, right, that is a sort of just cut from the distributed school amount that gets granted to the school districts, and then they decide how to spend it. They're bound by collective bargaining agreements that they have with all of their various representation units, and so they can't just make a furlough like we can at the state level, even if we reduce the DSA by that amount. So implementation and what it means on the ground is going to be different district to district based on their ability to implement whatever we decide.
Well, the other thing that I would add in too is that the special session is really just kind of the first part of the process. Wouldn't you agree, Senator, that it's addressing kind of the immediate, urgent, but the effects of this pandemic are going to be felt, as Michaela said, we probably won't bounce back in the same way that other states might. So the conversation about what education funding looks like is going to be something that's going to play out past this initial special session, I would assume. Is that correct?
I think that's fair. I think the long-term impacts of the pandemic are sort of to be determined. And I think I don't think a lot of people have a really good grasp on it, probably myself included, but I'm worried that the impacts on people, on the people of this state are going to be much greater than there's any expectation for at this point. I've seen unemployment projections in December at 18% in Nevada. During the Great Recession, we didn't go above 13.7 or 13.8. So that's a massive impact that's going to be felt by the people of this state. Their ability to pay new or higher taxes to fund education is going to be significantly undermined and curtailed. Businesses that have been forced to shut down for months, and those that come back are going to be struggling to sort of get their legs back under them. So finding additional revenue streams at this time is just incredibly difficult. And the longer conversation of sort of societal impacts, the role that those have on the education system, as well as revenue, are going to be carrying forward into certainly the 21 legislative session and beyond.
Well, and Michaela, if I can ask you, as we're talking about this and sort of the amount of money that goes to education, a group of parents recently filed a lawsuit against the state of Nevada. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it was basically suggesting or stating that the state hasn't been funding education adequately, and is in constitutional violation, I guess, and with its funding. Could you kind of just talk us through what that lawsuit is and sort of where it's at in the process and what that timeline looks like going forward?
Yeah, so the lawsuit was a group of parents from across the state who filed a lawsuit about the constitutionality of school funding. So saying that the state is not meeting its constitutional obligation. And so the court is not required to decide what that amount is or say anything about like what that costs. That's up to the legislator. All the state says, or all the court decides, is whether or not the constitutional obligation is being met. And so it's at the very beginning part of the lawsuit. The lawsuit happened late February, right before COVID hit. And then the Attorney General responded back asking to drop it. And so they're now writing back to them to then have the courts hear whether or not the lawsuit should be dropped in general. But that's common across school funding cases across the country. That step's usually there. These cases take about 3 to 5 years. They could take more. And so hopefully by that time, we'll see a rebound in our economy. And so this is less on the forefront of the mind of everyone in the court when that gets through. But again, the idea is whether or not the state is meeting its constitutional obligation. And yeah, and so that's like the whole process behind it. And it's looking at all students. So whether you're a general ed student, a gifted and talented student, special education, English learner, free and reduced price lunch student, it's looking at all students and seeing if the state is making their constitutional obligation.
And maybe it's an obvious question, but why Nevada? Why now? What was the impetus of it coming?
Well, so Nevada is one of, I think, 4 states that have never been sued for school funding issues. So majority of the states across the country, that's how their school funding has drastically improved, is based on a school funding lawsuit. A perfect example is Wyoming. They've had multiple lawsuits, but they also have one of the best funded school systems. As I mentioned earlier, they focus a lot on career and tech ed and other things. But I think at this point, the parents had watched and waited for the legislator to act. We had the perfect alignment before last legislative session, and it just felt like we continue not to see more dollars into education. We continue to watch Nevada fall. And so I think at this point, to make sure that students are receiving an education in which to enter any of the other states in this country and be successful, it seemed about the time to file that lawsuit.
And Senator, I guess, I don't know if you can comment. I don't know how this all works, but does this lawsuit impact how you and or the legislature go about your business, or is it sort of a wait and see process? Yeah. Okay.
I mean, fair question. I don't think I can't answer, but we'll see. I'll get in trouble. I don't try to legislate by threat or uncertainty. So I would continue to, I think, try to appropriate and budget plan based on what I think is sort of most important and feasible. I mean, I think what Michaela said just a minute ago was absolutely right. I think this lawsuit is a direct outcry of the fact that additional education funding wasn't even discussed last session, right? That I think that there was a broad expectation that with the sort of political change and the makeup of the legislature, that we weren't just going to, make it more equitable in how we distribute it, but we were going to talk about whether there was enough money. And it was radio silence on that front. I think that folks just sort of had enough, and they said, "Okay, lawsuit
time." I just wanted to jump in. We've said the word a couple times, but Michaela talked about adequacy, and Senator Kieckhefer talked a little bit about that. It's a word that gets used in education funding a lot, but I don't know that it's something that everybody, I mean, obviously, I think people know what the word adequacy means, but when we use it with education funding, what does that mean? Why is that such a hot topic? When Senator Kieckhefer was talking, and I was nodding my head, it was because I was one of those people going, where's the extra money? We aren't adequate yet. And so what is that? And why does it matter that we talk about not just how much money, but whether it's adequate.
Yeah, so adequacy is the idea that you're providing enough dollars to provide the appropriate resources for the students within your school, which I talked about a little bit earlier. And so adequacy comes through multiple different types of studies that have been done, or just through state discussion. But the idea is making sure that all districts and all students have access to the resources that are needed for every student to be successful. And so the idea is that you're going to need to hire extra staff to serve additional students who have additional needs. You're going to have to deal with small districts and large urban districts and come up with dollars to help there. And so the idea is to get those resources to make sure that everybody has the resources to succeed. And so that's where these adequacy dollars have come in. And Nevada's done multiple adequacy studies to see what the amount of dollars are that they've needed, but we've seemed to not put in the money to actually show that the results that those adequacy studies have recommended.
And I think the new formula itself sort of lays it out a little bit for what adequacy means in Nevada. If we accept that the weights that are adopted for the pupil-centered funding formula are what is necessary to provide sort of equitable levels of education for all students, then the dollar figure to meet those weights would then equate pretty evenly, I think, with adequacy. And that's about $1 billion a year in Nevada right now.
Now, you stole the question. That was exactly what, I mean, there's been a whole lot of studies, and I think that number just blows people away of how much money it would take to get to adequacy. But there, Michaela, maybe refresh my memory, there's an adequacy number, which is the biggest, and then there's a successful schools number that has been also proposed out there. And how much more money would that take, just to say, hey, here's what we think it would take to have a successful school, not necessarily adequate, but a successful school?
Yeah, I don't remember exactly how much it would be, but I think it's around 500 million to get there. But the successful schools number is saying, here are the schools that are successful in Nevada right now, and here's what they're spending. And so this is what we recommend that you spend for all of your general ed students. So that's what that successful schools number is based off of. The only problem with successful schools and why it has a different value than adequacy is, first off, it's based off of current expenditure. But the other problem is its performance level. So Nevada's highest performers are still only around 30 to 40% proficient in math, so it's not getting you that high level of proficiency that you may see in other states when they use the successful school model. But that's where that number comes from and why it's a little lower.
Perfect, thank you. So we've bummed everyone out about the amount of funding to education, or the not funding, but and we've talked a little bit about the pandemic. And we've talked about how the pandemic is going to affect the economy, but maybe there's, I guess, Senator, you've got kids that are in school, correct? So we're starting to see, as these school districts are starting to address how to return to school and all these additional measures they're going to have to take, most of them costing additional money to do. But we're facing potential budget cuts because of a declining tax revenue. What, I guess, not to be dire, but what's the path forward for Nevada?
Yeah, look, it's a very timely question, right? I mean, Washoe and Clark counties are supposed to have their academic year start August 10th. The emergency directive of the governor indicated that they need to give 20 days notice to parents and get board approval no later than 20 days. I think that backs up to like July, I forgot the date, mid-July, mid to late July. We're not going to end up in special session until early July. Districts aren't even going to know how much money they have to potentially meet that deadline. I think that there's a significant risk at this point that both Washoe and Clark County are going to have to push back the start of their academic years based on the uncertainty over money at this point. And we'll see how that plays out. I know Clark is going to present their initial plan on Thursday, as I referenced earlier. But that might have to change if they get a revenue hit that they're not expecting. And until the legislature and the governor can get together and start to provide some of that financial certainty for districts, they're going to have a hard time planning for how to welcome students back. And I think that uncertainty, and I mean, with the PTA, I assume it's a whole lot of parents watching. I know I'm anxious about it. My wife is. My kids are. I've got 4 going into the freshman year. I mean, 2 going into the freshman year of high school and 2 going into 6th grade and middle school for the first time. And that uncertainty is stressful. It's emotional. It's difficult for families to plan around, for childcare and for just everything that goes into our daily lives. And we need to get off the ball and get this done so that parents do know what to expect.
Do we anticipate? Sorry, Kenny, didn't mean to jump in.
No, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
That is obviously a huge issue. I participated in the working group for CCSD for reopening schools, and everything we talked about as potentials had price tags attached to it. Especially CCSD has school organizational teams where we get to look at the budget and see where the money goes. And so those dollars make more sense to a lot of us parents and teachers who've participated in that process. But I think there's also a question of how much federal money potentially will make an impact. And I know that's obviously you're not a federal legislator, you're a state legislator, but do we think that that's going to be a silver bullet? Like, is that going to magic? And again, are we going to know early enough to know if that money will be available to make a difference?
Yeah, it's an important question. There's a lot of talk about sort of CARES Act money that has reached the state. There was a certain amount that was allocated for education and for schools, and that's been sent to them. And I think a lot of it was taking care of the current fiscal year, quite frankly. I mean, I mentioned the $1.3 billion shortfall we faced for the next fiscal year. We faced an $860-something million shortfall for the current fiscal year, which is ending in a couple weeks. Or a week. Jeez. A lot of those federal dollars have been accounted for and already spent. I think that there is a lot of hope out there that the feds are going to come through with another package and bail out the states. I have perhaps less faith than some do in that. A state legislator, not federal. But I think it's a dangerous game to play to bank on it. And I don't think it would be fiscally wise of us to assume that we were going to receive some assistance from the federal government that may not come, because by the time we learn that it's not coming, our timeline to address that problem could be so short that the steps we have to take would be drastic. And the uncertainty is still there. There's hope, but I don't think it's something we can rely on.
And I think that's a common fear across all the states as well, is the cost to reopen is going to be much higher due to, getting technology to every student, dealing with internet issues, especially among a lot of our low income and rural areas. And then on top of that, dealing with transportation. If we are going into schools, how are you going to do busing? That's going to have an additional cost. That's an already expensive service as it is. And I think that's a common fear, is what states are expected to get from the federal government is much less than probably the costs in which to implement a lot of these plans are going to be. And so it's going to be a hard task placed onto our state legislators to try to figure out how to allocate and think about how we're going to fund some of these issues.
There was a really fascinating discussion that was happened at the Washoe County School District board meeting, the last board meeting, where it was all in the hypothetical sense, right, of like all the considerations that they're doing, but it was each avenue they went opened up a whole lot of other options, right? If you social distance, where do you put all the extra kids that you need extra classrooms, and then you need extra teachers. What about social distancing on the buses? What about social distancing in the cafeteria, right? And so, it's going to be really tough, I guess, for schools moving forward. And I feel for them. And that's an understatement. So, But at a different public meeting, there was a conversation that some people had that one person said, look, if we're going to go up to the legislature, we need to say, I want X dollars for Y program, right? So I want $50 million for a new curriculum, we'll say. And somebody else responded and said, look, I'm tired of having to defend why we need more money in education. We should just be able to say, look, we need X amount of dollars to educate our students effectively. So, Senator, if I could just ask you, you don't have to speak for all your legislative colleagues, but what is the more effective route, at least for you, when people say, look, we need more money in education? Is that enough, or does it help if you say, I need X for Y?
Well, I would never, pretend to speak for all of my colleagues. It's a diverse bunch. I am of the persuasion that we just generally need more money for education. No matter where you put it, there will be benefit, but I don't think that's a persuasive way to win an argument at the legislature right now. I think that specificity has value. As I said earlier, one of the reason we created all these categorical programs because there was a lack of faith that the money was going to be spent, wisely. And if I want to buy something, I sort of want to know how much it costs and be able to track it and measure it. So when we created the categoricals, for example, we put in sort of external third-party evaluators that would have to determine the efficacy and effectiveness of the programs, because that lack of trust wasn't there. The problem that we've gotten to is that we put sort of all of our eggs in the categorical basket, and it's eroded the base that funds the basic operations of the school district, like teacher salaries and general daily operations. So it's a double-edged sword. I understand people's frustration by saying we shouldn't have to justify this all the time, but it sure helps.
Completely fair. Thank you. Rebecca, I guess we've got a few questions out there that, is this an okay time to move to those?
Sounds good. I think I sent you the first one already.
Yep. So I'm just going to read it, and whoever wants to chime in, feel free. If and when weighted funding begins, what would the threshold be for money? Would a school need X number of students to get that funding? What about if that extra money doesn't give enough to make an impact? So basically that idea of the categoricals versus going to a weighted funding formula.
So if you're doing true weights, then there's no threshold for who gets the money. If you have one English learner student in your school, you get the weight for that one student, and you get that additional funding, in theory, if it follows you all the way to school level. Of course, money doesn't do that, it stays with the district. But so the idea being that, yes, it doesn't matter. One student would provide a true weight, and you would get that money. But the issue is, if the weight does not provide enough revenue for your school, then yes, you're not going to be able to hire a full-time teacher. And that's a big issue right now with our weights because they're not fully funded. Right now, they're just a small percent of the fully funded amount that they should be. So right now, it would be harder to purchase anything with those resources. And so the idea with categoricals, though, is that you take a grant, you divide it across however many schools you're utilizing, and you give that dollar, or how many students you're utilizing, and you give them those dollars. But again, as mentioned earlier, categorical funding or those types of funding isn't equitable across students, and at times it can be cut. And so that's a big issue too. And so you want to make sure that if we do start with those Zoom schools, that you're constantly adding money back in to get to the higher weights so that everyone else can utilize those funds appropriately for their students.
So I love this question because there's a bunch of different ways that it can go. But what about rainy day funding? Right, so we've always heard that we've got a rainy day fund in the state. What about that funding, and where does it come from?
I'll start with this one. So, I gave a presentation at the University of Nevada in January talking about the state budget, and I was so happy that we had 9.2% of operating expenditures in our rainy day account. which, look, in retrospect, I still think was good, but that was half of our deficit for this year. So that the state's rainy day account, so to speak, is gone. There's been a lot of talk about state education rainy day accounts, which is probably what I think the purpose of the question was. I have a sort of philosophical objection to that. I believe that it is the job of the legislature to appropriate money and prioritize how that money is spent, and that locking away pools of money for specific purposes doesn't recognize the flexibility that sometimes is necessary to get the job done.
I think going off that point, the rainy day fund has also been the idea that you're taking money away from education at times. In the past, it really had to do with marijuana dollars. But I think the point is the rainy day funds do come in handy when you hit times like this. But I think it's also important to figure out ways, disagreeing with Senator Kieckhefer, on how we can fund education and continue in a time of crises and make sure that we're not making drastic cuts and harming the future of our students. So sometimes maybe at the state level, a rainy day fund would actually be beneficial for education.
This might actually be getting really far into the weeds, but Michaela, you just touched on it, that some of the rainy day funding was coming from marijuana dollars, of which we had just talked about earlier, of how marijuana dollars were supposed to be going to education. I won't put you on the spot, Senator, maybe if you want to answer it too, or either of you can talk about it. Could you talk about the sources, or the two different sources of marijuana dollars, and how they are being allocated currently and going forward?
Sure. All right. So I'll start. The big question I think that came out was, how did the 10% marijuana excise tax end up going into the rainy day fund to start with back from 2017? Right. I think that was people's concern. So that was a tax that was proposed by the governor back in the 2017 legislative session, was not necessarily did not have consensus. Let's put it like that. So we budgeted in 2017, when we were building the education budgets, to include that 10% excise tax in the education budgets. So we assumed that all of the marijuana tax money that we were going to collect was going to fund education, and we put it into the distributed school account. And so the DSA was built up sort of flush with marijuana money. In the last couple days of the legislative session, there was still disagreement over how this was going to be implemented and where it was going to go. So what we ended up doing was using general fund to backfill the marijuana tax money, because the bill failed a couple times. So the revenue stream, the revenue was still reflected in the education budget. It was just being funded with general funds. And then when we finally decided to pass the excise tax money, we hardwired it into the rainy day fund rather than the general fund, because we thought it would be wise to start building up a reserve. So in the 2019 legislative session, that money started getting hardwired directly into the distributive school account rather than the DSA. As we talked about earlier, the way the DSA is built, that allows you to back general funds right back out at the bottom of the pyramid. So you always got to be careful when you talk about creating a tax for education, because it just relieves the legislature of its need to create general funds for it. So ultimately, right now, as it stands, the 10% marijuana excise tax is being hardlined into the distributed school account. It is funding education, as was the promise. We didn't back out 100% of the general funds on a dollar for dollar basis, so it was additive to the amount. There's also a wholesale tax that goes first to the Department of Taxation. We basically carve out the regulatory cost of the marijuana program and then put the rest of that wholesale tax into education as well. So marijuana money does fund education, as was promised, probably not to the tune that I think a lot of people were expecting. But we spend about $5 billion a year on education in Nevada when you combine all of the sources, and it was never going to be a panacea for our funding woes. That was a long answer. I'm sorry.
You did a great job. I think you covered it.
I get a little defensive on this question. I'm like, no, we put the money in. We put the money in the budget.
But I think that's always the challenge for us as citizens in Nevada, residents, is that we go, but how did it all line up? And then, of course, there's that feeling that it should have been something that we saw the benefit of in a bigger way, but it's that scale, right? You know, when you're talking about how much education costs, those millions of dollars, while they're millions, they end up, you spread them over the almost 500,000 students in Nevada, and they become much smaller. So I appreciate you taking the time to explain that.
Yeah, and to that point, you know, dollars get eaten up pretty quickly, right? When you start rolling up those costs, a 2% roll-up cost is, you know, several $100 million, and then inflation, and then all of those sorts of things. So you can easily increase education funding by $500 million, and you're basically keeping status quo.
Yeah.
So last question, and this is more of a philosophical question for you guys, but the question being posed by one of the viewers is, why is education funding an equity issue?
I can hop in first on that. I mean, the idea of funding is, what do you buy with those funds, and who receives the benefits of what you purchase? And so education for the longest time has always been an equity issue, especially in the terms of where you live, because it's funded by property tax. And so the idea is that if you were able to raise more property tax, then you were able to provide better things and provide a better education for those students in those areas. And that's something that across the country, we see huge issues in terms of equity between districts based off of that problem. And you can definitely see it among different minority groups and their funding compared to other places. But in Nevada, it's a bigger issue because we need the equity of the education that our students receive is based on the needs of our students. And so we do a good job of allowing the state to backfill a lot of our school funding parts so that it is more equitable in terms of dollar amounts. But the biggest issue is in terms of need, we're not equitable. So we don't do a great job of making sure that every low-income student or every English language learner or every special ed student is given the same resources, probably better, more sped, but are given the same resources to succeed. And so I think that's where it becomes an equity issue on who you're providing the resources to.
Yeah, I think, you know, the Nevada plan, right? Our old funding formula gets dogged a lot, but it was really good at maintaining equity. And we're one of the few states that was never sued over equity because we distributed dollars pretty much equally to students across the state. You know, but, you know, the idea that, I mean, I think the concept is that equity doesn't make it fair, though, right? And provide equal opportunity to people. So that's when we start, you know, talking about, as Michaela was indicating, the weights. So we've done a good job providing an equitable amount of education resources to everybody, but it doesn't meet necessarily the needs of all students.
Well, I think that's about our time. Rebecca, before I send it over to you, Michaela, Senator Kieckhefer, thank you so much for spending the time. To everyone out there watching, especially those who are working in education in any capacity, thank you guys for everything that you guys do. There's going to be some tough road ahead, but hopefully we can come together as a community and we can face it together. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you to everyone. Thank you, Senator and Michaela and Kenny. It is all about getting information and preparing us all to advocate. You know, Parent Teacher Association is the largest and oldest children's advocacy organization in America, and the foundation is trying to ensure that children can reach their full potential, and education funding is a big key to that. And so I appreciate everybody spending the time to talk with us tonight and those who've watched. And hopefully this is the start of even more conversations, because obviously Nevada has quite a road ahead of us. We already did, and now it's been made even more complicated. But thank you so much for everybody joining us, and we will have this recording available on YouTube too later this week. So have a good night, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.